2 plus 2 equals 5. The truth is whatever Big Brother says it is. And that's where we are now.
Hello, team, and welcome to Beerocracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross. I'm very excited today because I have Colin Cleary with me, who is an adjunct professor at GW and also a former Foreign Service officer. And we are going to be talking about what is going on with Ukraine. Colin, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Emily. Great to be here.
Okay. Obviously, this conversation requires beer, as all do, but this one really does. What are we drinking?
Especially. Well, it's almost St. Patrick's Day, so I have none other than Guinness. So
nice.
If you don't mind, I'm going to make a big pop here. And
go for it.
There you go. Good. And join you in whatever you're doing.
I'm drinking an Allagash White.
Okay.
I went to look for Ukrainian beer. They didn't have any, so I went with a beer with Ukrainian colors.
They might be too busy. I'm sure they're brewing beer, but maybe the exporting of it isn't happening right now.
Yeah. No, they have a little bit of stuff on their plate. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? And the question I always ask is, why should we trust what you have to say?
Well, you mentioned, Emily, I was in the Foreign Service for about 30 years, and I served mostly in pertaining to the subject of our discussion in Europe. I served in Russia for 4 years, in Ukraine, Russia for 3 years, Ukraine for 4 years, Poland for 4 years, a whole bunch of other places. So I've had my career had a lot to do with European security, but particularly from this East and Central European perspective. And I did so in Washington, from the Washington side of things too. I'm in the Foreign Service, so most of our career is spent in embassies, but we also spend about a third of our career in Washington. So I did, they trained us in the languages, and our job is to get out there. And my job was to work on the political issues with counterparts across the board. So I do have this life invested in these issues. And so it's been a terrible thing ever since this full scale invasion to see it collapse. I left the Foreign Service 4 years ago. And since then I've been teaching, as you mentioned, at George Washington. So I am now a free person to speak my own views after, representing the government and the positions of the administrations and talking points that we have to use to make sure that we're all on message. I am free from that now. So whatever I say, like it or not, it is it is what I think.
Yeah. Welcome to the fun side.
Yes.
It's great. So it has been a pretty terrible week for relations with Ukraine. There was that insane press conference that happened with Trump and JD and Zelenskyy, where it felt like respectfully Putin had his hand up Trump's ass and was just making him speak the entire time. Respectfully, of course.
Yeah, well.
What are your thoughts on that? And we've seen some terrible outcomes from it too. Cut off aid, and I think as of today have cut off intelligence sharing as well with Ukraine.
Yeah, well, as you say, we're going to have to be delving into our beer. Well, this is almost settled, so I'll have a sip because it requires it. Basically, what's happening is a world, as far as European security goes, it's a world turned upside down. And so the United States has been the leader since World War II in cultivating this incredible alliance, the greatest military and political alliance the world has ever seen in Europe, of NATO, and nurturing the development of the European Union and developing all these relationships and all these loyalties really across the entire continent, preserving it from the Soviet Union, the threat of the Soviet Union, helping them develop. And it looks like Trump is here now 80 years later to destroy all of that. So we're seeing the destruction of this edifice that was built up so meticulously over 80 years. And he's working not disruption, but destruction.
If, you have a lot of foreign service experience, right? And from what I understand, you were still in the service with Crimea, right? So maybe
yes, I was, yeah.
Can give some insight onto what things may be looking like now.
Yeah, well, you mean, are we going to, they've basically, here's the thing, 3 years into the full-on invasion. So there was a terrible violation in 2014 in Crimea and in the eastern part of Ukraine known as Donbass, where this Russian forces came in and annexed Crimea and fomented rebellion in the Donbass. This is in total violation of all norms of European security since World War II. So nothing like this had ever happened as of 2014. Europe dealt with it, but not definitively. And then lo and behold, 8 years later, Putin unleashes a full-scale invasion on Ukraine. So his goal has been obviously to take the entire country and control the entire country, if not to annex all of it, to annex substantial portions of it, and then control whatever's left. But he has failed. So 3 years later, the key message really is Putin failed in all of his major objectives. Ukraine still stands. They were able to not only hold off the initial invasion was very, a lot of territory was taken. Ukraine pushed them back. Half of that was retaken by Ukraine. Then Ukraine took some land in Russia itself as a potential bargaining chip. And they have withstood this terrible, unbelievable assault by Russia. So Ukraine is really essentially, victorious in the sense that they have Ukraine still stands. And in fact, their national anthem, the first line of it is Ukraine still stands. And they are proving that that's true right now.
Where do things stand on war front?
Well, so it was dynamic in that first year where there was this, multiple vectoral invasion in 2022. And then there was a reversal, and Ukraine forces heroically turn that around. And then they regained a lot of territory. They had unfortunately, they tried to do an offensive in 2013 to reconquer all their territory. But by then, Russian forces had dug in. And since then, it has been more of a attritional warfare. There hasn't been vast changes in the. I mean, there's been incremental gains on the Russian side, but they're only very incremental at huge cost. So here is a number that might blow you away, but the Russian forces have suffered something like 800,000 casualties. So that is dead, wounded, and captured. That is huge. And Ukraine has suffered. Ukraine has admitted on the record, the president of Ukraine, to 45,000 deaths of its forces. So this is a huge war. It's many times, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in the very end of the Soviet Union, 1979, and they suffered something like 15,000 deaths. So this is many, many times the death toll. So it is actually a very substantial war with huge human rights abuses by the aggressor, and they have suffered a lot more casualties because their tactics have been old Soviet, what they call meat grinder tactics, where they're having, they're just throwing people at the defenses. And so the Russians are losing a lot of people, but yet they still seem to be able to do it. So the bottom line is the front line, they've been making Russian forces have over the past year have made very small and at great cost gains. Ukraine did take a piece of Russia itself called Kursk, which they still hold. And so it's sort of at a standoff at this point.
I mean, it's terrible. War is terrible no matter where it is, right? But then it is also such a drastic difference in casualties and losses. Right? 800,000 compared to 45,000.
Well, 45,000 is dead. So you multiply, then the Ukrainian probably has 300,000 casualties.
Which is still a huge amount, right? Huge amount, but it is still a substantive difference.
It's at least 2 to 1, more than that even. Yeah.
Right. And Russia's brought in North Korean soldiers, right, to fight as well.
But their numbers are relatively small. So they brought in about 10,000 of them. They suffered about 2,000 casualties already. So I don't know if Kim Jong-un is rethinking that. But
he's not really known for his humanity.
No, but nonetheless, maybe that will reverberate badly amongst who knows? Maybe even he, as a dictator, has to watch it. I don't know. But the point is, you have drones from Iran. You have lots of Chinese, not weapons, but components that are used for electronics that have military applications. The Chinese are buying all the Russian oil that allows them to fund the war, and North Korean troops and North Korean weapons. So it is an internationalized conflict, really.
Right. So a lot of this began, right, because of NATO, or that was a lot of the excuses given were because of NATO. And Ukraine has been wanting to join NATO for a very, very long time. And it doesn't appear under the Trump administration it's necessarily going to happen. Right. And he has a lot of qualms about NATO, especially saying that like a lot of the other countries that are part of it don't pay their fair share. What are your thoughts on that? And also, what would it mean to have Ukraine join NATO?
Yeah. So fundamentally, that is a Russian propaganda point that unfortunately President Trump has embraced. That there's some element of this war that's about Ukraine joining NATO. A couple of things is when he launched that 2014 Crimea, and the attack in Donbass, the eastern region. Ukraine formerly was a neutral country. The previously pro-Russia leader had made Ukraine formally neutral and not seeking NATO membership. But that didn't stop Putin from invading and annexing Ukraine at that time. So in other words, the idea that this is about NATO is wrong. Secondly, if you can take the word of Putin himself. In 2021, he wrote an article, very widely disseminated in Russia and elsewhere, in which he basically said the subject of the article subject line was, "We are one people." In other words, there is no Ukraine. Ukraine is part of Russia. This has all been like a historical misunderstanding. These lands belong in Russia. I mean, it's incredible, right? That he laid this out, and that we are one religion, we have differences in language, but it's only just like a small dialect difference. And we all belong together. And when the Soviet Union made their republics, they artificially put Russian territory in there, and that's not right. But of course, I don't mean it doesn't mean, I'm not going to necessarily attack and invade, he claimed. But what he did was really meant it. So what it's really about is very clear. He wants to grab that territory back. NATO, as we know, is, all these Europeans were not investing in their military. There was no threat. And there's actually no prospect of Ukraine to join NATO in 2022. No prospect. It was back in their constitution that they wanted to join now, but there was no consensus in NATO to have them join. And that was not why he went to war. That's a talking point. But what he really wants to do, it's an imperial land grab, pure and simple. The empire wants to grab land that they have decided belongs to them. And they have the power to do it, and they're going to do it. That's it.
And look how it's turning out for them. It's turning out bad.
Well, it turns out that there is a Ukraine and that they don't want to be part of this. And that and he thought, of course, that he could go in there and sure, some people there'd be opposition, but it wouldn't be anything that they couldn't handle. And then that within, it was said 3 days or 3 weeks, they would take over the whole place and that would be it. Well, it turns out there is a Ukraine, and there are very determined fighters, and they were poorly equipped, and and they were attacked at multiple vectors by surprise. But nonetheless, they still stopped them and pushed them back. So there is a Ukraine. If there wasn't Ukraine, there wouldn't be people putting their lives on the line at those levels that we talked about to defend the country. They don't want to be under the Imperial Russian domination. They know what that's like. They had a terror famine under Stalin in the 1930s that killed 3 to 5 million Ukrainians. They have suffered for centuries under the domination, and they do not want to be part of the Russian Empire.
Right. Which super, super fair. It seems.
Yeah. I mean, they know what it means. It means the extinguishing of their nationality. That's what it means.
Right.
Yeah. More time for beer. This is a.
Yeah, no, I know. Drink break. Yeah. Drink break. Okay.
But they did, heroically stand up. That's why it's so tragic.
It's incredible
what Trump is doing now. That he's turning his back on this incredible heroism of these people who are, fewer. The country has there's probably about 30 million Ukrainians still in the country because many millions had to flee the bombing of the civilian areas. 3 years later, they're still putting up a fight. They're holding the Russian line pretty much. So, and they are reliant on, because Russia was using all these Soviet weapons that had been stored and were just obliterating Ukrainian cities. So they needed the assistance from the United States. But we were not the only. Europe did a lot. In fact, in aggregate, another thing Trump is constantly wrong about is Europe overall has done more than the United States has done. But nonetheless, the United States aid was very supportive, very important. Trump says, give us thanks. Trump didn't do anything. It was the Biden people who did it. Trump did nothing. He deserves no thanks. All he's doing is butting up to Putin, equating the aggressor with the victim. I mean, he is flipping everything over.
It's insane. I mean, I was reading before this that it appears that Ukraine's current military capabilities, about 30% is from the U.S. And I think the U.S. applies about 30% of it, right? Having that taken, and they've said it's temporary, whatever that means, right? Because they're looking at it and for making sure it's going to right causes.
Right.
And listen, Russia's corrupt, so we're not even touching it, right? A lot of the argument—
Not only Russia is corrupt.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. But, a lot of the Trump admins and a lot of people that are anti us giving Ukraine aid is that Ukraine is corrupt. Right. And from what I understand, Ukraine had previously dealt with corruption, as every country does. What can you say to dissuade those concerns?
Right. So, why they have, one of the things about the Trump people is they talk about they want to get rid of corruption, but then they get rid of all the inspectors general and their job, it's not like no one thought of this before, that, we have a checks and balances system, and people need to be checked, and people need to know that they can be audited. And that's what inspectors do. They audit in the government operations, make sure that if in this case, arms go, that we can account for what happened and find out if it didn't happen, if it wasn't used properly, who's responsible, et cetera. So it's ironic to a U.S. government that claims that it wants to get rid of inefficiencies in our foreign aid, that they do away with things like inspectors general. In case of Ukraine aid, it was very carefully, the physical transfer via Poland was done with U.S. eyes and visibility into all of it. And I have not seen a credible report at all. And it's $67 billion worth of military aid that the United States has provided. I've not seen any credible report of any significant amount of malfeasance of any of that aid at all. So, I mean, there is no, as usual in these fictitious stories, there's no evidence behind it. And in fact, the evidence that they've used it is the fact that they have the Russian army far larger, the Russian army far better equipped, has been held and checked by Ukrainian forces using our U.S. provided weapons. So that's why it's so tragic that this is stopping. There are some capabilities that the U.S. provides that are particularly good and can't be necessarily replicated. One of those is the famous Patriot air defense systems. Those are the best in the world. And so there are a number of those systems now that are deployed to protect civilian populations and other things. So if we don't provide it, then provide the defense, it means that those civilians could be obliterated by Russian incoming missiles. And we have other missiles that we provide that are very useful, called ATACMS and HIMARS. You might have heard of these. That these are very, very well developed, and now they're very familiar with how to use them in Ukraine to defend themselves. So pulling them away, you're right, 30%. Some people say it's now down to 20%, but that doesn't mean it's inconsequential. It's consequential and important, and I would say particularly that the Patriots.
Right. Yeah, I think the official was saying that they could last for like 6 months without U.S. support, and then after that, things would get a little bit hairy.
But, you got to get the pipeline going. You don't want to then start it in 6 months, because then this stuff doesn't appear instantly. So if their run out time is 6 months, and you're not in the pipeline, let's say 3 months before that, then you're going to have a serious problem. Last year, when the Republican Congress wasted 6 months and didn't approve the Ukraine aid bill for 6 months, there was a similar lag there, and the Russian forces took advantage of that lower supply to increase their lethality and kill a lot more Ukrainians. So that's what's going to happen. A lot more Ukrainians are going to die as a part of this. The goal, I guess, of Trump is, we're pressuring them to give in to a deal, favorable to Putin, but make it all stop. But, stop on what terms? As you just said earlier, there was an invasion in 2014. There's an invasion in 2022. Is there going to be an invasion in 2028? They want to make sure that they have security guarantees. That's what got the discussion getting hot in the White House on Friday, and J.D. Vance injecting himself stupidly.
He's a turd.
Yeah. Well, what does he know? Obviously nothing.
He doesn't know shit. None of them know shit.
Zelenskyy probably should have not said it, but he's like, what? He literally said, "What do you know? Have you ever been here? You're telling me about." Yeah,
and he was like, "I've seen videos," which was actually the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. Right. Insane. But there was a New York Times article that came out that both the French president and the British prime minister were literally coaching Zelenskyy on how to best appease to Trump and work him. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Flattery gets you everywhere.
Did you see the Brits? They pulled out the king invites you to a state visit. I mean, literally, we're at that level of
it's insane.
How do we appease our mad king? Essentially,
I know narcissism.
He's fact free. So I mentioned the fundamental issue of all the money we're giving to Ukraine. He constantly quotes a number that is. This is not something that's disputable. I mean, there is no $350 billion that we gave to Ukraine. We know exactly how much we gave. This is an appropriate amount of Congress that is accounted for. And it's something like 110 to 120 billion. So he's 3 times higher. So and he keeps using the number. He used it in the meeting on Friday. He used it in the State of the Union yesterday, or whatever you call that. I guess it wasn't State of the Union.
Congressional
it's like
address.
Insanity.
Yeah.
We live in a fact-free world. And in fact, Zelenskyy said something like that. Trump lives in a disinformation space. And that also got them all, how dare he make such comments?
And it's like, okay, you guys are all they're fucking nuts. Yeah. Well, they're not even like, that diminishes I have so many thoughts on them. One being they're all way smarter than we give them credit for, and diminishing
certainly about their own country and Russia. They know a lot more about Russia than,
Well, right. But if we diminish the high up GOPs at the moment, then they're just going to run circles around our ability to stop them. That
we're
being
doing enormous
said,
damage to ourselves. So the United States is shooting itself in both feet and various other body parts. And these alliances are big winners for the United States. We have our capability, and then it magnifies our capability through common action in Europe, and then in Japan and Korea. These are force multipliers, and we're just destroying it.
Yeah. It's never good to be alone. You need people and help to survive. Like, that's just common fucking sense.
So that's what we're doing now.
Right. Let's talk about this deal that was supposed to be signed, that Zelenskyy was there for, that ended up not happening, is apparently back on the table. From what I understand, it was a minerals deal.
Yeah.
And Zelenskyy wanted security guarantees, and that was not necessarily in the agreement, treaty, whatever you want to call it. What can you tell us about it?
Well, in a word, it's extortion. Okay, so you have a country that's on its back. It's been fighting. It wasn't the wealthiest country. It was in the Soviet Union for 7 decades and had a lot of ground to catch up to Europe originally, even before all these wars. And for 3 years, they've been bombed, killed, destroyed. And now they need these weapons to defend themselves. And so Trump then says, okay, this is a good chance for us to commit extortion and demand some compensation. He initially was talking about $500 billion of that they would put in a fund as they develop their rare earth minerals. The U.S. would get $500 billion. As I've just said, our total, the amount that we gave was 110. But also that has been given, right? And it was given. And what we got for it was, unfortunately, Putin decided to attack. But as a result of the defense of Ukraine, many, 5,000 tanks are destroyed, hundreds and hundreds of Russian planes, all those potentially aggressive troops are neutralized. So there's a lot of return on investment if Russia is.
And also the military equipment that we send is made in America, which is good for the American economy.
Right. So when we drain our stocks to give to them, which is, we then replace it with new orders for new things. So I don't know why this doesn't get through, but it doesn't. So basically this minerals deal was an extortionate deal, and we have no values anymore. It's all what's in it for me. America First is foreign policy as what's in it for me. So right now we're squeezing Mexico and Canada. The Trump administration was the one that renegotiated the former NAFTA. And he is violating that renegotiated agreement now that was signed in his administration. He's blatantly violating it. He talks about land grabs and McKinley foreign policy in Greenland and Panama Canal. And I guess Canada, is this a joke? Or can he possibly be in his own mind serious?
Well, my favorite argument is when people are like, well, we're voting for him. He's like, I'm the president of peace. And I was like, you just threatened like 3 countries in 1 hour. Okay.
Putin wanted peace too in 2022. He wanted to arrive in Ukraine and take it over in 3 days or 3 weeks and control it and have peace. That's the peace he wanted. He didn't get it because the people there stood up to him. And that's the non-peace. The non-peace is people fighting for their defense and their nationality. So what is peace? The peace of slavery and occupation by an imperialist force, or fighting for your salvation, for your existence, which is basically, this is existential for them.
Right. So what was in this deal?
It's simply that, like, they're also, these things aren't that developed. So it's this, future, there's nothing there to cash in on now. But, Ukraine's a large fairly large country. Traditionally they've had coal and other mineral development and things. And there's the expectation, this hasn't been mapped out in detail, in great detail, but that there's the expectation that there's, rare earths there at a reasonable quantity, not to solve all the world's problems. And so it's simply that we're trying to extort in their moment of difficulty. Okay, you need our weapons. He originally said, whatever then the second position was give us 500 billion of whatever you get in the future. Then the second one was, well, whatever we give you, we want you to give us twice as much as that in mineral resources. So I mean, it's pure extortion. I mean, I'm serious. That's really all it is. So it's about the rare earths that operate in high-end electronics and the batteries and other things that are more and more and more in demand. So that's what it is. And of course, there is a real issue there. China is out there trying to control some of the sources in China and in places like Congo and elsewhere. And so it is an issue to be aware of, but you don't need to extort it. The Ukrainians would be happy to free Ukraine, to have it developed and have their companies in cooperation with U.S. companies, but not, we want basically we want to just grab it and we own it.
We want a repayment of it. Yeah, no, it's insane. No, I mean,
it is. It's shameful.
Absolutely. It is so shameful.
Yeah.
Do you know what the security guarantees that were on the table? Do you know what they were?
No, there were none for that deal. So that was the issue. That's what the whole point with Zelenskyy was, that the deal did not have minerals deal. That's okay.
Nothing at all.
No, it was about the implication was, well, if you play nice to His Highness King Trump, then eventually maybe he'll be standing up for Ukraine because of future commercial benefits to the United States. But in fact, they're just as happy to do minerals mining. They made it pretty clear in Russia itself. In other words, they equate. There's no difference. So when he talks about deaths, it's the deaths of the invading army that has committed massive, terrible war crimes, and those defending themselves are equated. This is not the case. There is a country that has invaded and destroyed, really.
And to say Zelenskyy doesn't want peace was the craziest thing to me.
Of course. He doesn't want to be enslaved, have them, they know what it means to be under the imperial domination of Russia.
Killed immediately. They will become second-class citizens, and everything that they've known and loved will just immediately be thrown.
And who else knows it? Poland knows it. The Baltic countries, the ones that have been under their dominion, they know, and they've been saying it. The Germans, if you want to go back to 10 years ago, the Germans like, oh, we can, be nice with Putin and we'll do a gas pipeline and we'll give them a stake in European commerce. No, that all proved to be false. The more stake you gave him, the more that in gas, for example, natural gas supplies from Russia, the more that he thought he had something that would make them, Putin thought that he would put Europe at his feet, by that. It's not that he has a stake in Europe, it's that he can use it against them. That's what happened.
Wow. So you can totally say you can't answer these questions, which I fully understand. But
I'm a free man now. I'll do my best. I don't have to, my talking points are gone. So
gone.
If I have an answer, I'll give it to you.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you worked in the FSO, right?
Yes, I was an FSO.
Were you there during the first Trump administration?
I was. That was the time I left. And so that's why I actually mentioned, I happen to mention one of the things I was working on was the gas pipeline deal.
The Nord Stream?
We were opposed. Long story there, but yes, I should answer your question in a brief way. Yes, I was there, but I left right at the beginning of COVID. So I at the end, but I did stay for the first few years. Honestly, there's an issue there of if you get to a point where you're really not comfortable anymore with the policies. And, in my case, I had done my sufficient time in service that it wasn't going to be financially ruinous for me to leave. I just said, I just can't do it anymore at a certain point.
Well, so what was it like? You worked through many administrations.
It's upside down. We've been through phases of this. It started really with the second Iraq War under W. Bush. Now, W. Bush didn't want to destroy the Foreign Service, didn't want to destroy the State Department. He just made calamitous error of getting us into the Iraq War. He was not. He's not a bad he's bad only in the sense that he had no business being president because he didn't know about foreign policy and he made a lot of bad decisions with bad advice. But he is not out destructively, and he would use the institutions and those sorts of things, more or less, not perfectly, but nonetheless, the fact that you had a government that made huge mistakes, and suddenly we're in there. We've done this terrible mistake of taking Saddam out for WMD. There's no WMD, and now we have to fix Iraq. Meanwhile, we're still trying to fix Afghanistan, and we took our eye off that. So that's where we get the forever wars, coming from that. And so that part of that, honestly, breeds what brought Trump to power. People were like, what is this forever war stuff? What are we getting? What are we getting out of all this? People in the country, don't have time to look at these issues in great detail, or maybe whose cousin or brother or some family member came back from, there are many, many, literally millions of people who cycled through those wars over 20 years in the U.S. forces. And a lot of their people are like, what did we get out of this? What's it all for? The estimated cost of all that was $6.4 trillion. Okay, so there's a legitimate question about that. So what I mean is, there's been problems. That was a problem, the Bush period, in terms of just getting it wrong, and then comes Trump. And the public attitudes, his appeal, drew from the mistakes that have been made by W. And so there you have a guy who I guess is a neo-isolationist, and he's much more destructive. And so it becomes, we're in the Foreign Service. We're here to. The American people have elections, and so we move from, let's say, a Obama to a Mitt Romney, or an Obama to a John McCain, or where they have differences of opinion, but they don't throw everything out. We're not having a world turned upside down. They basically want the right things, all of them, but they have different. They believe in different ways of getting there. Now we don't want the right thing. We don't want the right thing. We don't care about the right thing anymore. In this Trump administration, they don't care about values at all. What's in it for us? How can we benefit from it? That whole issue of trying to, how can we, and again, W made a mistake, but I mean, they weren't going to take over Iraq and suck their oil out and that sort of thing. The mistakes were of a different order.
I think Dick Cheney probably would have liked that, but yeah.
Trump has said in hindsight, we should have done that. We should have taken all their oil. He says that. That's where we are now. Like, we think of ourselves, America, the first country that came, was formed based on these ideas of the Enlightenment, and for all the imperfections, that was why we were the exceptional country, because for all the imperfections, it still offered a pathway, and it's better than might makes right and rule by kings, and it gradually it overall gets better. Well, now we're going in the totally opposite direction. And we've given up on, we don't respect elections now. We deny reality. We say, my number of people at my inauguration, when you have the picture lining them up next to each other, these fewer people are more than these more people. And, there are 60 court cases, but no, none of it matters. Even the Supreme Court that I appointed says no, but it is what I say it is. So that's back to our high school reading of George Orwell, and we were too young to probably appreciate 2 + 2 = 5. Whatever the truth is, whatever Big Brother says it is. And that's where we are now.
So scary.
That's why you should have
beer break.
One of your participants actually needs to drink the beer. Talking about this. There's hope, but people have to get wise to it. Thanks to your podcast.
I'm trying my best. I am trying my best. It is a
very serious matter, and this matters to people. Breaking our alliance with our long-term, many, many very strong allies. These are serious issues. This was not said at the convention. I'm going to blow up our alliance. I'm going to go to bed with Putin, murderous Putin. I'm going to take over Greenland. That's what McKinley did when McKinley was president. He's talked about McKinley. I don't know if you've noticed this, but that's the president in the 1890s who got eventually assassinated. But he took the Philippines on imperialism after defeating the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. That was a disaster. We had no business being there. The Filipinos didn't want us there. There was a nasty insurgency there that thousands of U.S. troops died in that people don't even know about, and tens of thousands of Filipinos died. It was a disaster. And it was totally against U.S. principles. And a lot of American, Mark Twain and many others were opposed to it. It wasn't as if people didn't. It was an issue of those days. But now we're at the same, we're against, our country is supposed to stand for something. But the Trump administration doesn't stand for anything but what's in it for me. What can I get out of it?
You're not wrong. At the current moment, it stands for being owned by billionaires and a dictatorship, right?
Domestically and internationally. So I'm looking at the foreign side, but obviously there's the domestic side.
Yeah. I mean, we've never had a president that's been this so pro-Russia. Ever.
No. This is unique. And I fear the worst right now. I do really think we've flipped, and he's going to be essentially a de facto ally of Russia. He seems to like the rule by dictators. So Xi and himself and Putin will work out some sphere of influence, sphere of control idea where we're the boss in the Western Hemisphere. Putin gets more, domain in his region of Europe. Xi does what he wants in Asia, more or less. I mean, this is potentially, appeals to the authoritarian tendencies of Trump. What is he doing? I mean, this is against all U.S. principles. It's also a bad idea from a pure realist perspective. Russia has actually, in the aggregate, a very small economy. It's not in good shape. It wasn't even able to defeat. Imagine if the U.S. Army invaded Canada and wasn't able to defeat it after 3 years. How would that look? So I don't think that would happen, right? So that's what's happened here. They attack from multiple vectors too. We couldn't do that to Canada. They could attack from the south, the east, and the north all at once, and they couldn't do it. And they had all the equipment, the element of surprise, much more people. They lied and lied and lied and lied, as they always do about everything. They said, we're not going to do it. He lied right to the face of the French president. As the French president said very recently, 10 days before the invasion, he went there to try and talk some sense into Putin. Putin said, there's nothing to this. I'm not going to do that. So, they don't trust him either. It's not just Zelenskyy that doesn't trust him.
No, and there's no reason why anyone should.
No.
What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I'm afraid that the U.S. is now in a de facto pro-Putin position, and that undermines the alliance. So it's time now for the Europeans. They can't rely on the United States now, so that partnership is vastly undermined by Trump, and so they're going to have to do more. And they're already, this week they're scrambling, and they had special right after that horrific meeting in Washington, between Zelenskyy and Trump on Friday. The British Prime Minister called a meeting of all the Europeans, and they seem to be on the same page. The only one who's at a different place is the best friend in Europe of the Trump administration, Viktor Orban. I don't know if you know him, but the Hungarian leader is the guy who they relate to. He is completely fringe in Europe, but he is the closest person to the Trump people. That's why J.D. Vance, when he went to Europe 2 weeks ago in Munich, he spoke in favor of the extremist Alliance for Germany party, which is the far-right party. Yeah. So what they want is more of that, more like themselves, an extremist. Now the Republican Party is basically an extremist, nationalist, populist, anti-democratic party. So, they're good with elections as long as they win. But that's not how democracy works, right? And they're also they talk about, oh, you're Marxist. There's nothing more Marxist than denying obvious truth and making, the ends justify the means, and the truth, virtue, or the good thing is what we say it is, not good or bad. There is no good or bad except what the leader says it is. So that's what they're exhibiting. So they're far more Marxist, Leninist in that regard than anybody else.
It's insane.
There's something no positive about it.
No,
it's people,
crazy.
Marco Rubio, you saw him on the couch, right?
Yeah, literally singing in and then tweeting afterwards, being like, "That was great," and we're all just like, "Did you?"
Well, you could see him, yeah. So
we're like, "Do you know that we could read your face?"
Job because I'm sure he wishes he didn't do it. He's
and
not
also
a great guy either, but
no, I mean, let's also remind people that all of the senators voted for him, right?
But they were trying to give him. He was seen to be reasonable, but they were doing that. First of all, he was a senator.
Yeah,
so he's one of them.
Totally.
And he is knowledgeable. He knows.
He's not dumb, which is like more than we can say for some of the other cabinet members.
He would never do most of this stuff. He would not. This does not. Yeah. So I don't know how he can do it. I mentioned that when you're in the Foreign Service, you have to do the talking points. But at that level, to be saying this insanity that he has to then say, oh, that 2 + 2 = 10, and and just lie and repeat these crazy. It's called truth washing, right? Have you heard that phrase? Where you have Trump will say some crazy thing, and other people will go out and say, well, what it really means is this, or here's how you make that make some sense. I saw a Foreign Service person who was at the, I don't know her, but the current person who was the head of our delegation to the UN. is a foreign service woman. I don't know her at all, but they, the nominated person is the congresswoman who is not. They haven't put it forward because they're so close. She's from upstate New York, and the point being, they can't put her forward, so they kept the career person there, and they had to vote. They did a vote with Belarus and North Korea, saying, voting against a resolution that said Russia was the aggressor in Ukraine. And so I thought to myself, wow, that's a tough one to do. You really have to kind of find, that's a tough one. I mean, you're doing your job. You're supposed to represent the elected government of the United States. But imagine having to vote with North Korea, Belarus, Cuba, against Ukraine, against all our allies, and because you couldn't admit that Russia was the aggressor in Ukraine. It's just
so horrendous. Shameful. Well,
the world turned upside down.
The world is upside down. This has been a fascinating podcast with your insights, and thank you. And fun fact.
Okay, Emily, good to talk to you. And I will
likewise. Please keep drinking the beer. And I also at one point wanted to go into the FSO. And I took Arabic in college and studied Middle Eastern history and studies and stuff like that. And then I realized I generally don't agree with a lot of American foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully
thank you for your work.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously this has happened much more of late. And let's hope once again that this isn't the permanent. I wouldn't hesitate for people to join at the working levels. You're not dealing with the dilemmas that someone who's sitting in the seat at the council saying this in front of the world, for someone at that level, they really have to is this really what I'm comfortable
They're like,
with?
Did I just throw away all my morals? But Colin, thank you so much. And I'm your host, Emily Gross. And we'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.
Thank you, Emily.